It was a crisp morning in the Southern Sea, and the penguins were already gathering near the edge of a particularly large iceberg to chatter about the day's happenings. Amid these normally dignified citizens of the ice, one peculiarity stood out: a short, rotund penguin sporting a trench coat and a tilted fedora. If you squinted, you might think he was a little detective from a 1940s noir film. He certainly acted the part. He had a determined waddle, a suspicious squint, and a habit of referring to everyone he met as either pal or ma'am. His name was Wattlesworth P. Finley, known to most simply as Detective Waddles. Ever since Detective Waddles discovered an old black and white detective movie reel floating up from a tourist ship's trash dump, he had been smitten by the glamorous world of gumshoes and mystery. Everyone in the penguin colony found it strange. Penguins typically wore no clothing beyond their natural tuxedos, but Waddles insisted that his classic slightly too long trench coat gave him the aura of old-school detection. His fedora had a hole cut in the top so his little tuft of penguin fluff could peek out. He was confident that this attire made him the most formidable private eye on ice. On this particular morning, Waddles was in the midst of sipping a cold fish smoothie, one of the top local delicacies, when he spotted trouble. A puffin named Miriam was flapping her wings in distress in front of him, occasionally dropping feathers into the snow. She hollered, "Detective! Detective Waddles! There's been a break-in! At the Iceberg Historical Society!" Waddles adjusted his fedora, letting it slide back onto his head in an overly dramatic fashion. "A break-in, you say? At the Historical Society? That's no small potatoes." He paused to rub the underside of his beak. "Or, in this case, maybe no small ice chunks." "Huh." Miriam's face betrayed a little confusion. She cleared her throat. "Yes, well, you'd better hurry. I found the curator in a state of panic. Something's missing, and she's convinced it's significant." The detective peered at Miriam with what he hoped was his trademark suspicious squint. "Lead the way, ma'am." A short waddle later, they arrived. The Iceberg Historical Society was a squat, igloo-like structure perched at the top of a ridge. A sign on the door read, "Closed for Archives Day," but beyond the sign was a flurry of activity. The curator, an elderly emperor penguin named Gertrude, was pacing back and forth. She let out a frenzied squawk when she saw Waddles approach. "Thank goodness you're here," Gertrude said, gesturing with a flipper toward the inside of the building. "Someone has stolen our most famous exhibit, the legendary ice pick of Old Frosttown." Waddles raised his brow beneath his hat. "Ice pick of Old Frosttown? Enlighten me, dear curator." Gertrude led him inside. Through a small hallway lined with portraits of prominent penguin explorers, they entered the main exhibit hall. "It's an ancient ice pick, discovered years ago in the remains of an abandoned colony," Gertrude explained, pointing at an empty glass case in the center of the room. "Legend says it can carve through the thickest bergs without chipping. It's not valuable in terms of currency, but it's a priceless artifact for polar history." Waddles placed a flipper on the empty case. "Could be a collector's item, could be something else. Criminal types don't always need logic." He turned to Gertrude. "These leads are thin. We're dealing with an item that's important to the community but worthless to the outside world, except maybe to the unscrupulous. Any sign of forced entry?" Gertrude nodded and shuffled over to a side door that had been thoroughly shattered. "I found shards of ice and some footprints leading away. Then they just disappeared." "Disappeared footprints? That's par for the course in snow, but maybe we can figure out the general direction. We'll need an expert." The detective tapped a flipper to his chin and looked for Miriam, who was still standing in the doorway. "Pal, do you know if Momo the Arctic hare is around? She's a whiz at reading tracks in the ice." Miriam shrugged. "I believe she's out tracking walrus migration patterns, but I can go fetch her." Waddles gave an approving nod. "Do that, pal. Meanwhile, I'll conduct some interviews. No sense letting a scoundrel slip away. This case already smells fishy, but that might just be me, since I had sardines for breakfast." Miriam left to find Momo, and Waddles waggled over to where Gertrude paced anxiously near the shattered door. He gently picked up a shard of ice from the ground. Neither the chunks indicate the door was smashed in with something heavy, maybe a hammer, or even the stolen ice pick itself if someone used it in a cunning twist. Gertrude's eyes widened. Oh, I hope they haven't damaged the artifact. It's brittle enough after all these centuries. Waddles, hearing the urgency in her tone, rubbed his flippers together. Relax, ma'am. By the time I'm done, that pick will be back in your display case if I have to waddle across every inch of this iceberg. Gertrude's anxious expression softened, but only slightly. Thank you, Detective. I'll be in my office if you need anything. Waddles stepped outside and found a single line of footprints leading away from the Historical Society. After a few yards, the footprints seemed to wander, then vanished where the windswept slope of snow took over. He sighed. Cases in the Antarctic were always prone to these sorts of difficulties. Wind, snowdrifts, and a relative uniformity of footprints. Everyone here had flippers or webbed feet after all. That was one reason he wore the trench coat. It gave him the confidence to keep going when the environment tried to undermine his detective flair. He lifted the collar of his coat. All right, Wattlesworth, time to see this case through. Gathering a beakful of the frigid air, the detective marched off toward a cluster of igloo huts. His first stop was Frosty Joe's Cafe, a popular spot for local gossip. Frosty Joe himself, a plump Adelie penguin wearing an apron, looked up from behind the counter as Waddles entered. Detective Waddles, the usual fish smoothie. Not today, Joe. Waddles hopped onto a bar stool, which was really just a compacted block of ice. I'm on a case. The Iceberg Historical Society got robbed. You hear anything through the grapevine? Joe shook his head, the feathers under his chin flapping. News travels fast, but not that fast. I just opened up to serve the morning crowd. Private events got in the way last night, so I closed early. Haven't heard a peep about a robbery. Waddles studied Joe's face. No suspicious characters in here of late? Anyone talking big about antiques or relics? Not that I recall, Joe said, shrugging. We get tourists all the time, but mostly they're just looking to snap pictures of us in silly hats. He paused. No offense. Waddles tried not to think about how silly he might look in his own fedora. Understood. Well, do me a favor, Joe. If you see or hear anything, ring me up. He tapped the wide brim of his fedora. I've got sources, too. Joe nodded, handing the detective a small slip of fish-scented notepaper. Here's your tab from last time. Don't forget to pay it sometime, Detective. Waddles gave a flustered nod and scooted out of the cafe, the paper stuffed in his coat pocket. Next stop, the local fish market. If there was a place that shady types liked to hide, it was around fish markets, especially if they needed a quick meal. Penguin criminals were known to rummage for a free herring. But as he waddled past stall after stall selling fresh cod and guppies, he found nothing but mild interest. Most vendors greeted him with friendliness, others teased him good-naturedly about his coat, and no one mentioned seeing a frantic, door-smashing thief lugging around an antique ice pick. Eventually, he turned down a narrower alley looking for leads. He wasn't exactly sure what he'd find, but detective stories had taught him that the saltier corners of town often hid crucial answers. The alley was empty save for a mound of discarded fish bones, but Waddles took a moment to rummage around them, just in case. Nothing but a half-chewed cod skeleton. Dejected, he left the alley. He was contemplating heading to the other side of the iceberg to check out the tourist huts when a voice called from above. Detective! Hey, Detective, is that you? Glancing up, Waddles noticed Momo the Arctic hare perched on a ledge, her long ears standing upright. She hopped down gracefully, leaving deep paw prints in the snow. Miriam found me. I took a look at those footprints behind the Historical Society. Our thief is heavier than most penguins, but with a smaller stride length, which suggests a walrus, possibly. Odd, right? A walrus smashing in the door? Waddles raised a brow. A walrus? They usually travel in pods near the water, not to mention. Why would a walrus want an ancient ice pick? Momo shrugged, her twitchy nose wiggling. No idea, but the footprints definitely match a wide body and short steps. I followed them to a cliff overlooking the ocean, but they vanish at the edge. My guess is the culprit either dove off or hopped onto a chunk of ice drifting away. Waddles rubbed the underside of his beak, thinking, we might have a walrus on the run. That's fishy indeed. He paused. Momo, I need you to help me check out the shipping docks. If there's a stray iceberg floating off with a walrus on top, maybe we can track it. or see if someone spotted them departing? Right away, she said, scampering off. It didn't take long for Waddles to catch up with Momo at the docks. Several large chunks of ice were strapped to small buoys or roped up near the pier. Seagulls circled overhead, cawing in annoyance. An old sea lion named Captain Barnacles was busy retying a knot on his fishing vessel. He froze when he saw Waddles and Momo approach. "Ah, if it ain't the detective in a fancy coat," Captain Barnacles said, tipping his own scruffy hat in a mocking gesture. "What brings you to these cold waters?" Waddles spoke while adjusting the collar of his coat. "We're looking for suspicious activity last night or early this morning. Someone might have hopped onto a drifting hunk of ice with an antique relic, possibly a walrus." Captain Barnacles scratched his whiskers. "A walrus, you say? Well, I did see a big feller earlier mid-morning maybe. He was on an iceberg about quarter-mile offshore. Looked like he was fiddling with something. Now that you mention it, he had something long and shiny. Could have been a fancy twig or an ice pick for all I know." Momo's ears perked up. "Any idea where he was heading?" "Seemed to be drifting toward the broken floes," Barnacle said, pointing out to a region of shattered ice lumps floating in the distance. "Current out there changes direction midday, so it might carry him further west." Waddles adjusted his fedora. "That's plenty helpful. Thanks, Captain." He paused, rummaging in his coat pocket. He took out a small folded piece of paper. "I owe you for that tip. Do me a favor and keep your eyes peeled. If you see that walrus again, blow this emergency whistle." Barnacles raised a brow. "A whistle? I only accept real payment like fish or coin." Waddles sighed. "I don't exactly have money for bribes." With an awkward shuffle, he pulled out the slip from Frosty Joe's. "Would you accept my cafe tab as evidence of credit? If that's worth anything." Barnacles snorted. "Detective, you might be a good penguin, but your sense of finance is questionable." Nonetheless, he pocketed the slip. "I'll keep an eye out." Relieved that they had at least a clue, Waddles thanked Barnacles and waddled along the edge of the ocean to the vantage point near the broken floes. Momo hopped beside him, scanning the horizon for any sign of a drifting walrus. "This is going to be tricky," she said, shading her eyes from the glare of sunlight on ice. "Everything blends together out here." "That's what I'm counting on," Waddles said, ominously. "I suspect our thief might believe he's hidden in plain sight. We can use that against him." Momo twitched an ear. "Your plan?" "Simple detective's cunning. We'd lure him out somehow, or we could get help from some folks out on the open water." Waddles rummaged in his coat pocket for a battered old notepad. "We have some fishermen who share radio signals with each other. Maybe they can help us track a floating walrus." While Momo dashed off to find the nearest radio operator, Waddles walked along a frozen ridge, scanning the watery expanse with binoculars. They were child-sized binoculars he'd found in a tourist's lost and found, so they pinched his eyes, but a detective had to improvise. After several minutes of scanning, he spotted movement. A large, blubbery figure perched on an iceberg about half a mile away. Even with the distance, it looked suspiciously like a walrus wearing some sort of satchel. The figure disappeared behind the iceberg a moment later. Waddles' heart raced. He had a suspect. Without waiting for Momo, he began carefully sliding down the ridge, flippers out, shooting forward across the ice. He half tripped, half surfed down, sending snowy powder into the air. His trench coat flapped behind him like the cape of a very ungraceful superhero. Yet he managed to keep his balance well enough to land with a muffled thump on the lower plateau. A sudden whoosh from above signaled Momo's return. "Detective, radio set up. They'll keep watch on the horizon. Did you see something?" Waddles pointed out to the broken ice. "I saw a walrus, or something large floating on an iceberg. Let's circle around to the next vantage point." They pressed onward, leaping over small cracks in the ice. Occasionally, Waddles would struggle for comedic effect, his short flippers not built for bounding leaps. But Momo gave him a paw. The detective's fedora nearly blew off 3 times, yet he caught it with flair each time, refusing to compromise his style. If he solved a case hatless, how would that look? They came around another ridge. From there, the wind died down just enough to let them see the shape again. This time, it was undoubtedly a walrus, a massive figure with two gleaming tusks and brownish blubber. Next to the walrus was a large, battered suitcase. When the walrus shifted position, Waddles glimpsed the glint of metal. The ice pick, presumably. The detective's heart soared. He had his culprit. "How do we approach?" whispered Momo. "He's out on a chunk of ice. One false step and we'll be in the water." Waddles' eyes narrowed. "We need a vessel or a cunning ambush. If the walrus sees us coming, he might slip into the sea with the artifact." A voice croaked from behind them. "You folks need a ride?" They turned quickly, startled. It was Captain Barnacles again, perched on a small wooden boat that he'd somehow managed to navigate through the scattered ice like a stealthy sea lion. "Saw you from the water, looking at that walrus. Figured you might want assistance." The detective nodded vigorously. "Yes, please, Captain." "Just get us as close as you can without spooking the big fella." At first, Barnacles had trouble edging the boat through the flow weaving around each chunk of shifting ice. Waddles clenched the sides of the boat and prayed he didn't have to swim. Penguins might be fine swimmers, but a swirling sea of ice was a different story. After a tense 15 minutes, Barnacles managed to steer them near the backside of the walrus's makeshift iceberg, just out of sight. Momo hopped onto the ice first, then helped Waddles up. The detective adjusted his fedora, his breath catching in his throat. This was the moment of truth. They rounded the corner of the iceberg slowly, flippers and paws silent on the crunching snow. A low humming noise drifted across the ice. The walrus was singing under his breath, a tuneless melody as he busily chiseled something on the surface of a smaller chunk of ice. The stolen ice pick glinted in his large, wrinkled flipper. In a single motion, Waddles stepped forward, brandishing a small magnifying glass he liked to carry for dramatic effect. "Stop right there, bud. You're messing around with stolen property." The walrus jerked around, eyes wide. "Who are you?" His voice was deep, rumbling like ice sheets cracking. He stood to his full height, overshadowing the little penguin. "Detective Waddles, Iceberg Investigations," declared the penguin, his coat flapping in the brisk wind. "You're in possession of an artifact stolen from the Iceberg Historical Society. Hand it over." For an instant, the walrus hesitated, glancing at the sea. Waddles could see him calculating the possibility of leaping in and escaping. But Moma blocked part of his path, and Captain Barnacle's boat was on the other side, effectively hemming him in. The walrus let out a growl of frustration. "I needed this pick. I'm an ice sculptor, okay? I live on the outskirts, where no tourists come. I've been waiting all my life for something that could help me carve masterpieces into these bergs. But no one took me seriously. They said, 'Walrus can't sculpt.' The museum wouldn't loan me the pick, so I took it." Waddles blinked, lowering the magnifying glass fractionally. "You? You stole a priceless relic just to sculpt ice?" The walrus nodded, looking both defensive and sorrowful. "I hammered the door with a chunk of rock to get in. I was desperate. I planned to return it eventually, once I proved my worth. I never intended to break it or get caught." His gaze fell to the battered pick in his flipper. "You damaged some property, bud," Waddles said, trying to keep his authoritative tone. "And stole something that belongs in a museum. That's a crime, no matter how you slice it. Or chip it in this case." The walrus hung his head. "I'm sorry, but you have no idea what it's like to be mocked for wanting to do something outside your normal, everyday skill set. Walruses are expected to lounge around, eat clams, roll in the surf. Try telling them you want to create beautiful ice statues of penguins dancing under the aurora and you get laughed at." Waddles glanced at Momo, who frowned sympathetically. The detective gave a small, resigned sigh. "I can appreciate that everyone has dreams, but we all have to follow the rules. If you'd approached the museum and asked, maybe they could have arranged a supervised demonstration." "They turned me away before." The walrus braced his tusks in frustration. "Said the artifact was too fragile." Waddles took a step forward. "That's no excuse for theft." He took the ice pick gently from the walrus's flipper, checking for damage. The handle looked intact, though scuffed. Waddles returned his gaze to the walrus, who sank down onto his blubbery haunches. "So, you're taking me in?" the walrus asked in a shaky voice. "That's the protocol," Waddles replied gently. "But with any luck, we can talk to the Historical Society. Maybe you can do some volunteer sculpting work for them in exchange for leniency." The walrus let out a sigh that sounded like a deflating balloon. "I'll do whatever it takes." Captain Barnacles, who had been watching from a safe distance, pulled his boat around so they could all board. The walrus glanced down at the detective as he stepped into the boat. "You're quite the odd bird, huh? The coat, the hat." Waddles smirked. "I'm a penguin who believes in style, and I believe in justice served with a dash of compassion. Let's get you back to land." Back at the main iceberg, the group made their slow journey to the Historical Society. Gertrude nearly fainted when she saw the large walrus, but Waddles explained the situation calmly. To his surprise, the conversation went better than expected. Gertrude was outraged at first by the theft, but as the walrus haltingly revealed his dream to carve awe-inspiring ice sculptures, her feathers seemed to unruffle. She was, after all, a champion of preserving and celebrating polar creativity. When a glaring policeman puffin arrived, Waddles stood between the walrus and the puffin, explaining that while there was definitely wrongdoing, the real story needed hearing. After a tense discussion, a compromise was reached. The walrus would face a formal apology hearing before the Colony Council and make restitution for the damaged door. In exchange, the Historical Society, seeing the walrus's genuine passion, offered him a place in an upcoming exhibit about polar arts, under careful supervision, of course. Gertrude gave him permission to replicate the shape of the ice pick with his own chisels, so long as the original remained safely locked away. Satisfied, the puffin promised not to cuff the walrus on the spot, at least contingent on a successful hearing. Once the arrangement was settled, Gertrude turned to Waddles. "Thank you, Detective. You recovered our artifact and kept this from escalating. We owe you." The detective tipped his fedora in a modest bow. "All in a day's work, ma'am. Truth be told, I didn't expect the thief to be an aspiring artist." Gertrude chuckled slightly. "Life's full of surprises. Now, do you mind returning that pick to its case?" "Certainly." Waddles took the artifact and carefully placed it back in its protective glass display. "Safe and sound," he said, and snapped off a crisp salute. Then he turned back to the curator, his eyes shining with relief. A few onlookers gathered, curious about the case's resolution. Miriam the puffin fluttered up and squeaked, "Detective, is the case solved? Did you get the pick?" Waddles nodded proudly. "The pick is back, the thief's in custody, sort of. And the story behind it is bigger than you'd think. But as I always say, behind every caper is a clue. You just have to keep your eyes open." He paused dramatically, then added with a wink, "And in my experience, wearing a snazzy trench coat and fedora helps too." The crowd chuckled. This caused Waddles to stand a little taller, crossing his flippers in imitation of every suave detective he'd ever seen on the old movie reel. Then he realized something important. By the way, Gertrude, my fee for services is, how do I put this? Open for negotiation. Coffee tabs, fish smoothies, or maybe a small donation in my name to the locals who keep this place running?" Gertrude stifled a laugh. "We'll see to it that Frosty Joe's tab is paid, Detective. Maybe that'll keep your local cafe from hunting you down again." Waddles' beak curled into a proud grin. "Thanks, ma'am. That's mighty kind." As the small crowd dispersed, Momo approached the detective with a curious look in her eyes. "You ever think about taking that coat off? It's sweaty business, especially chasing thieves across the ice." Waddles adjusted his collar, letting a bracing gust of polar wind ruffle his feathers. "Maybe someday, but not now. A detective's gotta look sharp, even in the line of duty." Momo rolled her eyes and hopped away, muttering something about never understanding the whims of penguins and coats. Waddles watched her vanish into the rush of snow, a chuckle escaping his beak. He returned to the society's entrance, where the walrus was quietly apologizing to Gertrude in a low voice. Waddles patted the walrus's shoulder with a flipper. "Hey, buddy, Good luck with the artistry gig. Maybe someday I'll see your sculptures in a big exhibit and I'll say, I knew that guy before he was famous. It'll give me some detective cred." The walrus's large eyes glistened with gratitude. "Thanks, detective, and sorry for all the trouble. Sometimes you want something so badly that you forget the right way to get it." "A lesson learned, pal," Waddles nodded. "You can still chase your dream, but do it legitimately. Stealing's no good. We all have to abide by the rules here, or else the ice cracks under us." With that, Waddles quietly left the Historical Society, weaving his way through the drifting snow back to the main waterways of the iceberg. The sun was still high in the sky, reflecting off the snow with a brilliant glare. Up ahead, the detective could make out the bright sign for Frosty Joe's Cafe. He felt the comforting weight of the wad of receipts in his coat pocket, now happily worthless, or soon to be covered by the curator's generosity. That was one less worry. His next case would probably come soon enough. Trouble had a way of roaming these chilly lands, especially with so many gullible tourists around. As he made his way inside, Frosty Joe greeted him with booming laughter. "Detective, Gertrude was here. Settled your tab plus a little extra. I guess you're my best paid customer now." Waddles chuckled, tipping his hat. "Sometimes the luck of the case smiles on me, Joe. Maybe that's why I keep wearing this coat. Keeps fortune on my side." He ordered a fresh fish smoothie, claiming a cozy seat near the window. In the corner, a pair of rockhopper penguins were whispering about some new rumor. Something about strange lights beneath the ice. Waddles sipped his smoothie, ears perked. He'd wait, see if anything panned out into a real lead. Antarctica was vast and full of secrets after all, and there was always room for another slippery mystery on the horizon. But for now, he could take this moment of calm. He had solved the stolen relic case, returned a prized artifact to its rightful home, and found a surprising motivation behind the crime. That was plenty for one day. Next time, maybe it would be a missing fish haul or a broken igloo fiasco, or suspicious footprints that led to a hidden treasure chest. Who knew? All that mattered was that Detective Waddles, penguin in a trench coat and fedora, was on the case. He finished his smoothie in one long swig, smacked his beak contentedly, then set down the cup. The aroma of coffee fish brew wafted around him, mingling with the crisp air seeping in from the doorway. Outside, an occasional swirl of wind battered at the cafe windows, testifying to the raw ferocity of polar weather. Waddles might have been just another penguin in a crowd, but the sheen on his fedora and the sway of his trench coat told a different story. He waddled outside, feeling the bracing chill, and adjusted his coat. The horizon glittered with ice floes, drifting lazily under the frigid sun, and somewhere out there was the next puzzle waiting to be solved. He could sense it. With a tilt of his hat, he set off down the snowy path, humming a little detective tune under his breath. If anyone needed a sleuth who was equal parts determined and ridiculously overdressed, they'd know where to find him, scanning the horizon for trouble, ready to shuffle into action at a moment's notice. After all, a perfectly tailored trench coat and a weathered fedora had a certain power here on the ice. They weren't just clothes. They were a promise to the colony that he was the penguin to call when a mystery surfaced. And as Waddles strolled away, leaving a trail of little prints in the snow, one thing was certain. The cold never bothered him anyway. Not when there was a fresh case to crack, and not when he had a fashionable coat and a burning desire to keep Iceberg investigations open for business.